I need to scoot out before, so maybe I'll sit over there by Ann. Maybe that would be great. Thank you. We set? Good morning, everyone, and welcome. We're so glad that you're here. I have been looking forward to this day. I think we have all been looking forward to this day for some time. The 200 years to the day of the founding of Virginia Seminary, right here in the space that was our chapel. Today for us to give thanks and celebrate that long history, but also to recognize and acknowledge that our mission partnership continues. We continue to do work together. And today we're combining two annual lectures, the Horne Lecture and the Dyer Lecture. Both have deep connections to this relationship of Virginia Seminary and St. Paul's. In 2008, I believe, we started the Martha J. Horne Lecture in honor of Martha's ministry at Virginia Seminary as Dean and President. And then in 2017, we started the Mark Dyer Lecture. Mark Dyer, Bishop of Bethlehem, Professor of Theology at Virginia Seminary, and Amy and Mark were both pastoral associates here at St. Paul's as a way to honor and celebrate them. And then we're keeping the theme going. The Reverend Dr. Judy Fentress Williams is with us today, a friend of St. Paul's, has been here many times. We're delighted to have you today. You remind me of Dr. Wilmer, that first professor who had many jobs at once, and he did them all beautifully. Dr. Fentress Williams is not only a professor at Virginia Seminary, but also the senior associate at Alfred Street Baptist Church. She is a prolific scholar. She is an amazing, masterful teacher and preacher, and she's just generally delightful and joyful. And we're glad to have you with us. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Fentress Williams.
Thank you all very much, and thank you, Orrin, for that lovely introduction. I am delightful after coffee, and so I am really grateful for that. And it is my tremendous honor to be here for the Horne Dyer Lecture. Martha Horne and Mark Dyer are two people who have shaped me and formed me. Martha was the Dean and President of Virginia Theological Seminary when I was invited to be a part of the faculty. She opened the door for me. I don't know if she remembers this, but when I came to give my lecture, she offered to make copies of my handout. She showed me a wonderful model for leadership, someone who was authoritative and calm, fearless, and knew how to work with a group and bring about consensus. And I remember her most for her gratitude. She thanked us all the time. She thanked us all the time for doing our work. And we wanted to be better because of that. Thank you, Dean Horne. When I came to VTS, I was assigned to work with a member of the faculty to learn how to do small group. And I was assigned to Bishop Mark Dyer. And I learned a lot from Mark Dyer. I learned about liturgy. Mark had a wonderful way of honoring the liturgy, but not worshiping it. And that was so important for me as someone who is not Episcopalian. I learned about liturgy. I learned about theology and Bible. We spent a lot of time talking about the Song of Songs. But Mark Dyer is hands down the best storyteller that I have ever met. And I just loved being in his presence. And I didn't care whether I'd heard the story 17 times before, because I knew that every time he told it, each iteration had its unique inflection. And it helped me to be a better reader of the Bible. I remember the day when he told me that he and Amy were seeing each other, and all the joy and love that he had in his voice. I will be forever grateful to him for his friendship and his example. So I thank God for Dean Martha Horne, and I thank God for Bishop Mark Dyer. Now, the title of this lecture is Generations, Genealogy as Story in Genesis. And I suspect that you are all here because of all the genres in Scripture: Gospels, Psalms, wisdom, prophets, or those great narratives. There's nothing you'd rather focus on than genealogies. Deep down inside, you like that list of mostly unrecognizable names that can barely be pronounced, that often seem to show up inconveniently, interrupting the story just when it's getting good. And if you, like me, grew up reading the King James Version of the Bible, we called this section the begats, right? So-and-so begat, so-and-so begat. And let's not forget those amazing names. Tubal, Javan, Sabta, Sabteka, Naphthalum, Pathrusim, Kaluhim, Arpakshad, Jobad, Almodad, and Obal. If you are from the right place in the rural South, you know someone with one of those names. And that's the truth. Genealogy, simply put, is a list of descendants. The word we have in English, genealogy, or a record of descendants, is the translation of a Hebrew term that we call toledot. That noun, toledot, comes from a verb, and its triliteral root, yalad, simply means to bear or to bring forth. So when we talk about toledot or genealogy, we're talking about descendants, offspring, generations. What comes behind you or after you? One of my professors by the name of Robert Wilson did some significant work on genealogies, where he documents the history of criticism and says there was a shift in scholarship from this obsession with the historical accuracy of genealogies to thinking about it more through the lenses of sociology and anthropology. And biblical form critics, he reminds us, taught us that when we think about genealogy, form is frequently influenced by function. Form is influenced by function. The way the thing is shaped has everything to do with why I'm telling you this story in the first place, right? Where I place my emphasis will betray why I'm telling you about these ancestors. Form critics would also say that function can sometimes be limited by form. And so we want to explore that a little bit. In what ways might it be limited by form? Genealogies come in a couple of forms. We have oral genealogies and we have written genealogies. And if you've ever been to a family reunion, you know about oral genealogies. This is when the two aunts are in the corner talking about whose child that is. And they go back and forth. No, that's not so-and-so's child, that's so-and-so's child. And they're carefully reconstructing this lineage, careful to omit the names of the relatives that they don't want to remember. We do this all the time. We constantly edit genealogies. The challenge then of a written genealogy is there's no way to exclude someone who's there or maybe to remember the person who's been omitted. Genealogies come to us as linear, father, son, his son, and yes, he's in this world, straight down, or segmented. This father has 3 sons or 4 sons, and then we follow each of those lines. That's a segmented genealogy. So in Genesis, when we think about the function of genealogy, particularly in the first 11 chapters, this primeval or primordial history, what function do those genealogies, what function do those begets have? In the book of Genesis itself, that phrase, these are the generations, or that toledot formula, appear 10 times. Well, if I say 10, I'm fudging it a little bit because I want symmetry. It's actually 11, but I can make it work. So, in the primeval history, Genesis 2:4, Genesis 5:1, Genesis 6:9, Genesis 10:1, and 11:10, all in the first 11 chapters. And then when we get to the ancestral narratives, Genesis 11:27, 25:12, 25:19. We can count 36:1 and 9 as one because they refer to the same person and it can be seen as repetition. And then Genesis 37:2. I don't know if the shapers of the book of Genesis were thinking about symmetry, but it's nice that we see 5 in the prehistory and 5 in the ancestral history. In the primeval history, these Toledote formulas come in strategic places. At the end of creation, they come to list Adam's descendants. They come to tell us about Noah's family before the flood, Noah's family after the flood, and then the descendants of Shem. Listed at strategic places. The creation of God is finished. Now what? Genealogy. Adam and Eve are exiled from the Garden of Eden. Now what? Let's have a birth story. After we have that episode with Cain and Abel, which is most unfortunate, what do? What happens next? Genealogy. Genealogy in the primeval history is the connective tissue. It's what makes these independent narratives actually function as a story. Through the narrative lens, genealogy signals that there's more to come. There's more to come.
Actually fit quite well with what you were saying.
Well, not that one. I don't know. Yay. Okay. All right, we're back. So we have these independent units, and the genealogies make it work so that it's one story. And they remind us that at the end of every episode, there's more. All right? So the reminder in these genealogies is that the creation that God made in Genesis 1 is creationing. God said, be fruitful and multiply. And every time we get a genealogy, we see, okay, it's still happening. These lists of names take us from one generation to the next. It's almost like you're on a train. Next stop. The genealogy gets you from here to there. That's how it functions. And when we understand that genealogies function in this way, then it's not just shaping a narrative, it's actually creating a narrative. All right? The genealogies make the whole of Genesis 1 through 11 something that it wasn't before. And if we consider the fact that those genealogies are added later, then we know that they were added intentionally to shape those units. If we understand it works that way, we can conclude that genealogy doesn't simply facilitate a story. Genealogy is the story. Genealogies are doing more than giving us all of these difficult names. They themselves are telling us something. Case in point is the genealogy of Jesus. I know you didn't think I was going to talk about Jesus, but I am, just for a moment. So you know this one. This is in Matthew chapter 1. And Matthew 1 has a genealogy of Jesus that contains 3 sets of 14 generations. It tells us in verse 17, so all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. From David to the deportation of Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation of Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. This is a beautiful genealogy, beautifully shaped and curated, but not accurate. All right? In order to make this work, you've got to zhuzh it a little bit, right? You've got to, but the point is that this curated set, 3 sets of 14 generations, means that the way the genealogy is created is telling us it is time for the Messiah. It's time for another big thing to happen in our history. So the form of the genealogy speaks to its function. It's not simply telling us who came after this next person. It's formed to make a point. So with that in mind, I want to spend a few minutes examining what is happening in Genesis chapter 10 in the Table of Nations. So come with me now back to the primeval history. That might be a little blurry, but I can explain it to you. Remember now, we have in the primeval history the story of the flood. Noah goes into the ark with 3 sons and their wives and his wife, and they all come out. All right? So before the flood, we get a genealogy, and after the flood, we get this thing, the Table of Nations. This is, as you can see, a segmented genealogy right? One name at the top and 3 names underneath with their descendants. And just looking at it, not even being able to read any names, what do you observe? Lots of kids. They were fruitful and multiplied. Anything else? Yes. All right. So Japheth's is pretty short. Ham's is more substantive, as is our friend Shem at the end. So the order here is Japheth, Ham, and Shem. All right? Which is curious because that's not their birth order, right? Whenever we get the birth order in the Bible, it's Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And because Ham's the middle child, he doesn't move. But Japheth and Shem have shifted. And so the order of the table of nations starts with the youngest and makes its way to the oldest, which works against the traditions that say we start with the firstborn son. The firstborn son is everything. And so we want to ask, why is it ordered this way? The form tells a story, right? The form has its function. So one obvious thing we could say is that we conclude with Shem because the story is going to shift its emphasis and focus onto Shem. So from a literary perspective, it's really nice to kind of end with Shem and then keep running with Shem all the way through. And that is supported in the text because this is in chapter 10, but in chapter 11, verse 10, after the Tower of Babel, we go right back to Shem. So the reader or the listener doesn't have to remember that far back to continue the story with Shem. The length of descendants also suggests to us that the story is less interested in Japheth than it is in Ham or Shem. And we want to notice that the genealogy there for Ham is substantive. And that in the genealogy we have reference to both Ham and Canaan, his son. In fact, whenever Ham is mentioned, he is often associated with Canaan, his son. Canaan, his son, after whom the Canaanites are named. And so even the way I tell the story has something to do with what I want you to take out of the story. So what I'd like to do is focus first a little bit on Ham, and then maybe we can transition to Shem, because what we have here in this genealogy is material surrounding it that has material about Ham before chapter 10 and material about Shem after chapter 10. If we go to Genesis chapter 9, verse 18, we find these words. The sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. That's the right order. What do we get next? Ham was the father of Canaan. Why do we need this random information? All right? Because we know from the genealogical table they're all fathers of somebody. But the only person who gets referenced here is Ham. All right? Pay attention. These 3 were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was peopled. Noah, man of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. He drank some of the wine and became drunk, and he lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. When Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, then they took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and they're kind of walking backwards, covering the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away. They did not see their father's nakedness. The writer wants you to know they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed by the Lord my God be Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. May God make space for Japheth, and let him live in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave." What did Ham do? This is a really tricky question because we don't really know. But let me tell you what we do know. In other legal texts, to uncover the nakedness of someone suggests sexual intercourse. In this story, then, Ham uncovering his father's nakedness could mean that he had sexual relations with his father, or it could mean that he had sexual relations with his mother, or it could mean that he observed his parents in an intimate moment. None of these options are good. What it means is that whatever he did, he trespassed and crossed a boundary with his parents, somehow seeing vulnerability, somehow with this hint of sexuality, which I don't want to lose because of the way it comes up again later in Genesis. In this story, Ham does something that he's not supposed to do, and his brothers go to great lengths by walking backwards and covering up their father to do the right thing, which means now we have Ham over here and Shem and Japheth over here. And that pattern of a son who has done the wrong thing or is in disfavor versus a son who has done the right thing is the way that the genealogies and the lines of succession get sorted out throughout the book of Genesis. There's Ishmael and Isaac. Ishmael's the oldest technically. He's the person who should get the birthright, but this is problematic for many reasons, including the fact he's not the promised one. His mother is Egyptian. And then we get that passage in Genesis 21, where Sarah gets upset because Ishmael is playing with Isaac. And we don't know what's happening there. And it may be as simple or as harmless as playing with his brother because they're brothers, or imitating him because Isaac is little and he's probably, doing things that little people do. Or the fact that he is acting like an equal with his brother is a cause of concern for Sarah. But whatever is happening with Ishmael, that story is a part of the series of things that makes him come into disfavor. Esau and Jacob. Esau's the oldest, but he can't get the blessing, and we have a story about why. What we see is a pattern that helps us to determine why this person doesn't get it and why this person does. Or let me push it a little further and say why this person deserves the blessing and these people do not. It reminds us that not only is genealogy a story, but story is genealogy. If we think about this passage, which precedes the table of nations and is followed by the genealogy about Shem, can make the case that Genesis 9:18, all the way through the end of the primeval history, this whole unit is a big genealogy. And this genealogy is shifting us from primeval history, where we focus on one family, to the ancestral period, where we now have nations and peoples. We're in a world of politics over here, and this is one of the stories that helps us to shift over. If we come from common ancestry, if we come from Adam before the flood, if we come from Noah after the flood, we still have the same blood. And in order to get to a world where we have Moabites and Ammonites and Edomites and Amalekites and all of the ites, in order to do that, we have to do something with our construct of identity. Familial identity is a construct. National identity is a construct. And genealogy and story is often the way we determine who's the us and who's the them. And the lenses that we use to tell those stories will often cast it in such a way that we will tell a story that says, and we deserve to be us, and they deserve to be them. That pattern emerges in the Bible. The story, whether a genealogy or otherwise, explains or justifies why we do what we do. Oral histories, for the most part, go back 10 to 12 generations, right? A really, really long oral history or oral genealogy goes back 14, which means our memory is relatively short. I teach at a seminary where students come for 3 years. And I'm fascinated sometimes about how they describe the old days. They don't know old, all right? Their knowledge only goes back to what the seniors who were there when they came in remembered 2 years back. That's what they know about the past. And it makes me wonder, how far do we go back when we tell the story of who we are? What is the depth of our genealogies? One of the limits of an oral genealogy is that it can only go back, for the most part, 14 generations. The benefit of an oral genealogy is its fluidity, that every time I tell it, I can tell it differently. That when I embody it, without saying a word, I can tell you who I like and who I don't like. There's something about that orality that we need to preserve when we read the text. The shapers of the primeval history were telling a genealogy from a particular moment in time where they had some things they needed to say about Canaan. They had some things they needed to say about the Egyptians. And they weren't nice things. And they put them, all those people, under the lineage of Cain, which is really interesting because technically, if you think about it from a geopolitical perspective, the Canaanites should be related to the Israelites. Oh, here we go again. Yeah. So should I not go backwards?
I think it's just being fussy.
Okay. So technically, the Canaanites should be related to the Israelites, but the Israelites don't want the story to work that way. And so they move them over here to the descendants of Cain. When they tell the story, they are shaping it for the purpose of their telling. The question I have for us is, as recipients of this received text, how are we going to tell the story so that we remember that that's not all there is? How do we encourage folks who hear this to read in between the lines, to go back to what happened before the storyteller starts their story? What are the things we do in the telling of this text that open this up? So one of my questions is, what is to be gained by going back beyond where the story begins? What can be gained from examining all the characters, not just the one who has the mic, but the ones who don't get to speak? How might we begin to imagine the perspective of those other characters? How does it shape our identity to know that the people we call our enemies were not always our enemies? This past week, we celebrated the bicentenary. That's what we called it at VTS, the bicentenary of the institution. And I was able to sit in on a panel where I think it was six people from churches from New York down to North Carolina talked about their histories and talked about going further back in their histories and going to graveyards and finding graveyards that had been unattended, and what that led to in terms of what they learned about who they were, how it changed their identity, that there were white churches that thought they had always been white, but they weren't. You just had to go back further, but it was all in the records. And so I'm just intrigued with how we might reshape our identity by going further back. What happens when we unearth more stories? What happens when we go back to see the shift in the narrative? And what happens when we reintroduce the orality to the telling of our stories? These stories are written, but when we embody them, we change them. When we tell them and stop and ask that wonderful godly play question, I wonder, we open up possibilities that did not exist before. It's my hope that as we continue to celebrate all that God has done in bringing this church to this place and in bringing the seminary to the place where we are, that we not just read our stories, but we tell them, that we embody them, that we stand in that lineage, that we go back and tell it all. Genealogies not only remember what has happened, but carry the hope of future generations. I'm going to attempt this one more time. Okay. Nope. Okay.
Got it.
Okay. Yes. Genealogies function in the realm of family. As I said, when your aunts were telling their stories, they're also, as is the case in this biblical genealogy, political. I wonder what the theological implications or the religious implications are in the telling of our stories. How can we tell our stories as stories of what God has done for us? We came to the end of the story of Cain and Abel, but God didn't end our story there. God allowed us to continue to another generation. So that one of the ways we can get over our anxiety of telling the fullness of our story in the past is by remembering that God's still working forward. Am I making sense there? I feel like let me try to say it this way. Part of our reluctance in going back is we're afraid of what we're going to find, right? Let's just be honest, right? We're afraid of what we're going to find. I'm always anxious when I give a lecture and somebody comes up to me and says, "Oh, I knew you in 5th grade." Oh, no. Right? I can't remember. Like, what are they going to say? What did they remember about me? But the beauty of genealogies is that they're not just looking back. The fact that every time, after every episode, God continues and there's another generation means that there's always hope going forward. So my hope is that as we tell our stories, that we will remember what is behind, but that as we remember God's faithfulness in spite of ourselves, we can tell it forward. I will stop there and take questions.